Welcome to part 5. So far in this recommission and ride project, we've focused on taking this bike apart to assess for wear and damage. We've also started cleaning the engine and parts and refurbished the cylinder head. Today, we'll be overhauling the disc brakes. This bike's been stored in a shed for just 8 years, so it's really quite surprising how much corrosion has set in a relatively short amount of time. Thanks for joining us. Let's get started.
Okay, just show you first the disc brakes on here. The front disc brake, you remember it's quite rusty. The best way to clean these up, you've got a piece of wood and you've got your 80 grit paper. So we're using WD-40. It doesn't really matter what you use. You literally just go around it like that. Just keep it flat. Then on the other side, you just got to be careful you don't rock this about too much. You can squirt on here. Wear gloves. That's all you need to do. With cast iron, it does rust up quickly. So if it's not going to be used on the bike for a while, just coat it with WD-40 and it won't rust over. Okay, the oil tank. I showed you one of the mounts here at the top would crack through, so we'll weld that back on. Gonna paint it back over later on, just blow it in a little bit. Someone mentioned about filter. So we've taken the tank filter out. There's actually two on here. You've got a tank filter and you've got a filter in the bottom of the crankcase. If it's pasty, a little bit pasty, don't worry too much because an engine is running. You've got a certain amount of metal contact, like the rings are in contact with the cylinder bore. And there is obviously wear there over a period of time. And if it hasn't had sufficient oil changes, you will get a little bit of sludge, which is paste really, building up in the filter. It's doing its job. If you've got metal filings with bits of metal, then you're starting to think, is the main bearing breaking up? Is that part of a cage? That's where you've got to worry a little bit because you shouldn't get any debris, real metal debris. Now on all these engines, the gearbox is separate because the oil is just literally supplying the engine and back to the tank. Japanese bikes, and I can't quote others at the moment, it does the gearbox and the engine. So if you were a bit harsh with your gearbox, you could be knocking a part of your tooth off in your gearbox, and that's got back into your oil filter. But make sure you do your oil changes regular, you know, always cheap. Do it once a year at least. I showed you last week there was an extra hole here. This is on the hanger for the exhaust, you know, both the silencers. So extra hole, we welded it in, so we migged in, just going to rub it back, put some paint on there. So that's been done. We mentioned about caliper, about getting seized up pistons out. Now, I've put the caliper in the vise. I've already done this up, so where your oil line feed would come in, take that out obviously, and put a bolt in. Find a bolt, the right size thread, screw it in, don't over tighten it, and the bleed screw, take that out, and you put a grease nipple, to show you. Put a grease nipple in there. The idea of this now, we clamp it back in the vise, and when I attach the grease gun, you'll see when I start pumping, hopefully these pistons moving out. So this is the best way to do it. Rather than grab hold of those pistons with a pair of swan neck grips and putting jaw marks on the surface area, which is going to mark it, and also it's going to make it hard to go back in, which time it will probably rip the seal on the inside. This is the safest way to do it. Just pump that with grease and push them out. And what we can do now is take the bolt out. I've probably pushed a little bit too much grease in there, so it needs to get a little bit of grease out. By putting a screwdriver between the two pistons, you won't damage anything here. All I'm doing is just forcing the grease out the top. That'll be enough now. You've got a gap now. Now we can actually put our fingers in the back here. As you can see, we're free here now. We've just got to push this one back in a little bit more. So just put your screwdriver between again. And what we can do now actually, rather than fiddle around, I can just split this now and it'll drop out. It's the easiest way. There you go. Just wanted just a little bit more. Now when one comes out, The easiest way is to take the whole plate off. The piston was in this side, that's now full of grease. Now what we've done is put one vice jaw back in your vice, where you have normally the oil hole, which is now full of grease now, that's going through to the other side of the caliper and getting behind the piston. Just put your vice jaw in your vice, in your jaws here. Just tighten it up there. Just make sure you can still get onto your grease nipple here. And all you're doing is stopping that grease now being forced out, which would have been into the other side. Reattach your grease gun and now pump again. You'll see that other piston moving out. There you go. The most common thing that happens with when people take a piston out, they will grip it with swan necks and you'll get scoring marks here. And when they put new seals in the caliper, they press the piston back in, the gouge marks they're caused by the swan necks actually damage the seals very quickly. If you ever do that, you need to get a bit of wet and dry or a fine file and file it off those high spots where you gripped it. But if you do it with grease like this, you won't need to do it that way anymore. Okay, so we just need to get all that grease out now. So all the O-rings and the seals, not worried about, we left those in there at the moment. Yeah, most important to blow this grease out. You haven't got to be too careful because we're not going to use these again. But the main seal at the back, just get an old screwdriver, get underneath it, just lift it out. That's your main seal. And this one here is the dust seal. Now this has got a bit of metal to it as well, so you've got to be a little bit careful prizing this out. So it might be better to do it in the vise. Okay, that is quite easy. So this is the dust seal. It came out easy. So we need to clean up in here. But this is a seal that we'll wear first, and that will let the debris in. And when that debris gets into the main seal, that's when your trouble starts. But all these will be replaced. It's a bit knocked over here. It's probably been out before. Now when you get a little mark like here, we just need to just tidy that up. It's got a line around here, but there's no pitting or gouging anywhere. Now you can see our pistons are fine. There's no scoring, they're as good as new. Same with this one, we'll take our back seal out first. Just get underneath it, just lift it out. There you go. Right, this is the back caliper. Don't know how this one's going to go. Because the actual brake pads are seized up in there, it's easier to dismantle the caliper first, take the side off, then we can push these out, hopefully. They're quite corroded. Okay, that's the best way, because they're all rusted up here on the side. Get a screwdriver under this one here. Okay, you can see here in the hydraulic line, in the brake line, we've got a gun jewel in here. That's in the brake fluid. So that's not good. It's all water content. So you can see that it's still damage here. So now we've got to see if we can get this piston out. So we're going to join him back up and see if the grease trick works on this one. Let's just see if there's enough room to get this one out. Yes, there is. It's a bit wider on the back one. Now this one here hasn't moved. So what we suggest we do, we split the caliper again, we blank off the hole, and we should get full pressure on that side. This one's going to need a new piston because it's quite badly damaged. Okay, you can see here rubber. Now I think you'll find that is actually all off the dust seal. This is where, you know, obviously seals are starting to break down. This is, like I say, this will be the first one that gives trouble. Now I've cleaned this up, it's got to be replaced, but we'll just show you the pitting You removed all that surface rust, but this is why you can't use this again. We're going to reassemble this now. We put the pistons back in partially, and we're going to blank it all off so we can put it into the glass bead cabinet. We're just making sure we don't get any glass bead inside the back of the caliper. So we're just going to nip the bolts up. Okay, so what we've got here is a very basic glass cabinet. We've got glass bead in here. It will really transfer this into a very serviceable item. It won't look like this, it'll look completely different in a moment. So yeah, just put it in. You won't see a lot of this blasting, you'll see the first bit. Just show you with a bead blaster, if you was to leave a piston exposed, a new piston, what damage it would do. It's dulled that right off. It's completely blasted that, you know, so it's giving it a real matte finish. That blasted internally will damage the bore of that caliper very easily. Just a little bit of brake cleaner, and we're just going to clean up round here where the seals go. Very carefully, we just go around the top of that. As long as you don't put anything in the back where the piston runs, just make sure there's no debris there. Just going to put this together for now. We need new seal kits and we do need new pistons for it. So we're just going to keep that loosely together. Okay, because it's cast iron, we blasted it, we just need to have a bit of protection really. So a little bit of a blow over silver paint. Put the old pistons back in and blanked it all off so we can actually cover it in paint and won't go all inside. Rear master cylinder. It's pretty corroded. The only problem is going to be getting this Allen screw out. I think with this Allen screw we'll do is we'll just buff around here on the wire wheel first, and a little bit of heat around here with the blow lamp if we've got enough gas in that, just to warm up that area. And hopefully we can just ease that Allen screw out. Then we can unscrew the barrel hopefully. Well, this is a feed in from the reservoir at the top into the cylinder where there's so much corrosion around here and water. There's two holes, one there and one at the back. So we're just going to clean up a little bit around here and then we'll try and warm it up slightly. This is a process a bit like when you solder up a fitting. Where you've got flux and you put a bit of solder around it. When it gets hot enough, it draws the solder in. So it's called a capillary action. So we heat this really as much as we can get on here safely. Then we'll spray it and it should draw the WD-40 down the thread into the body. That's where it's boiled. There you go. That's corrosion. There you go. So what we need to do now is just take out the seal, the main seal and the spring. I think if we just push an Allen key out the back, you can just push it out. That's it, that's the seal. So we've done front caliper, rear caliper, been apart, cleaned out, painted because the back one wasn't very good. We painted that, so we've done the front one as well. We're going to put the original pistons back in this one. We've got an old pair in there now because we were blasting, as you know, and painting. The master cylinder, which was a bit of a problem. We weren't sure whether we could actually service this, but it's all serviceable. We can actually put a seal kit in that, and that'd be fine. New brake hose to go on. So it really is, everything's cleaned up, waiting for seal kits and new brake pads, front and back. But it all came apart, which was really good, really, considering what it looked like. Okay, so we've got all our parts now to rebuild the calipers. We're going to do the front and back caliper, then we might get on to doing the master cylinder. Just going to take the bolts out, buff off the silver paint that's on the bolts. We're just cleaning inside here, and this first part of the caliper. This is where your main dust seal fits. So we need to get away any of the bit of spray paint, any corrosion, any rust. So we'll give this a buff up. We're just getting the main bulk of that paint out first. We need to clean any of this corrosion back completely, because the only thing we have sealing up here is where the O-ring runs, and it sits on here like that. You just need to get rid of all this corrosion so we get a nice fit. We don't want any leaking of brake fluid past the seal, and the caliper wants to be nice and tight because it's got to be flat, because you've got the pistons in there and you've got the pads in there, so it's got to be a nice flat fit. Then it's not distorted on the disc. Yeah, just get your wire brush and just clean in where the seals go as much as you can. We're going to give this a blowout with an airline in a moment, then we just coat it with a brake cleaner. Before we reassemble, just a little bit of, this is 220, a bit wet and dry. Put on a little bit of WD-40 and just clean round. You're going to push your pistons in a moment just to make sure they slide in nicely. From appearance, they look the same. One is the main seal and one is the dust seal. This one is the main seal, which is just solid rubber. That goes in the bottom. And this one here, which is like a double lip, is your dust seal. And that's retained in the holder, and that goes in the top. So just check that first. Well, you'll know anyway. Okay, so we're ready to go now. We've just cleaned out both halves of the caliper, making sure, obviously, where the piston's going to run, it's nice and smooth. We haven't got any corrosion, any rust, or any debris left where the seal will go, and the wipe seal at the front. And we just check with the pistons to make sure it goes in freely. And so now we need to assemble this up. So we put the seals in with brake fluid, and then we will install the pistons. Just working down and get something small like a screwdriver, and just make sure your seal comes up and goes into the retaining part of the caliper. Hold the seal in place. Don't avoid anything sharp, because you don't want to damage that seal. So this is the metal part, the retainer, the outer part of the dust seal holder. Just hoping it just holds it in place. Because the size is almost too big, you have to try and gather it all up with your fingers. And at the last little bit, try and make sure that's in. If you do that and rub around on your finger, it should stay. So that little bit of grease will help. So that's in place now. Now that now sits on the top, in there like that. Try and push it down with your fingers first. Now, we haven't got a big drift. It's actually easier to put that in the vise. This is a little bit fiddly because it doesn't go very far down, so it's just really a case of holding it and just tapping it down. It's slightly sprung. Actually, hammer works better. Holding it with your fingers and just come the other side. And I'm just going to check with a flat punch. Now coat this with a little bit of brake fluid. This is so your seal is not dry when you're pushing your piston. When you're installing that piston, we have plenty of lube around the dust seal, obviously the main seal, but it's the job to work that down. There is a slight taper here, and that has got to work over the seal. Once you've got onto the main surface of the piston, it's okay, and got some depth to it, but it's the first little bit that's riding up over on that. Bring your bolts down so they're both just nipping. Don't forget we got a rubber seal on one side, the O-ring. Just do even pressure now. And it's really just a good nip on both sides, and come back. Then that's it. Okay, when you come to overhaul the caliper, when you got it all apart, just make sure where the seals run in the caliper behind is nice and clean, because if you've got any corrosion in there where water's got in, it's corroded. When you put the new seals in, they won't sit in properly, and when you come to push the pistons in, they won't expand back properly. And that is always the job to get the piston in to start with. As you can see, there's a slight taper, but you have to get it past the seal lip. And once it's got itself parallel, it will go down. But if you've got debris behind, you will have an issue, and you could end up chopping that seal. So make sure it's really nice and clean, and make sure when you put your piston in that you've got, not telling people to suck eggs, but you've got plenty of lube around those O-rings, because it will slide on better around the piston. Okay, when you've buffed up your bleed screws, just make sure that the holes are clear. That one's clear, but this one is partially blocked. So we blow it from the inside out, really. Just blow it through with an airline. A little bit of welding rod, just poke it in the hole, and just make sure that hole is clear. Because if you don't do this, when you come to just back this off from its seat, you'll find that you won't get the fluid coming out when you come to bleed the brakes. Okay, so we're going to put the pads back into the caliper, just finish off the overhaul. We just put a little bit of copper slip on the back of the pad. Don't obviously get any copper slip on the braking surface area, because obviously you won't have a very good brake. So just a tiny little bit, because the piston has contact with that. So we just make sure you have the holes that will line up with the holes in the caliper. That's for the split pins to go through afterwards, and just put that through like that. Because you've got the pistons right back, they will flap about quite a bit. You get your new split pins with your kit. We're not going to bend them over today in case we need to take them out, but just so it just finishes off this job today. We just put just a little bit of a bend on there so it doesn't just drop out on me. And there we go. So the disc has got plenty of room to go back on, and the bolts go back in and hold it onto the fork leg or the swing arm assembly. Okay, master cylinder. We're going to put the rear master cylinder back together. Now, the only reference in the book is for front one. It's exactly the same except for the way it activates, and it has a extension for the reservoir. But the main body is exactly the same. But what is so important is when you come to doing this, you have your manual. Have your manual, Haynes manual, or the correct Triumph one in this case, manual to work by. Because if you've taken it apart and left it a few weeks, you come back to it, you're not going to remember, unless you're doing it every day, the sequence, how it goes back together. We never stop learning in life, do we? So reference your manual, take your time and put it together. Because you don't want to make a mistake with it, thinking that I can do it, I don't need a manual. I always look at it, because I don't do these very often. Okay, so we've now finished today. On this here, we've got the rear caliper, the master cylinder. That's going to be painted. The plate will be put back on when we come to put it back on the bike. The caliper has both sets of pistons right back, so we can put the disc back on quite easily. The adjustment will be made when we put it back with the pedal to get the linkage right. The front master cylinder, we haven't shown you that, but it's exactly the same. The only difference is the front one has the reservoir on the top of the master cylinder, as this has a pipe that goes to the master cylinder up by the oil tank. It's exactly the same, so we don't really need to show you that really. But that's it really, the brakes are ready to go back on.